Neil, just out of interest, were you taught about evolution in school science over here in this country?
Yeah, we were, but it wasn't a big part of the curriculum. It was just sort of like, oh, these are the facts, quickly, blah, blah, blah. There you go, that's facts, move on to learning other stuff.
Yeah.
It wasn't really covered very heavily when I was
Same here. I grew up in America, and I've always had an interest in this, but it was through books and magazines which I found, National Geographic, stuff on TV, but I don't really remember it being taught in school either. But you've probably noticed lately, looking through the news, that in certain schools, not just America, but other parts of the world, they are trying to take it out of the curriculum altogether.
Yep, they don't like people knowing that we evolved.
That we evolved from apes, I think, is what really upsets them. You know? And as Richard Dawkins says, we are apes. And something we found, which is interesting, was from the bbc.co.uk website, the news and science section, the Test Your Knowledge on Evolution quiz. I thought that maybe that we and the listeners could test our knowledge on evolution, you know?
Good idea, because as the test says, evolution is based on well-accepted scientific principles. Yet there are many misconceptions, so test your knowledge here.
Okay. Number 1, humans are still evolving. True or false?
I would give this one a true.
Yeah, I think so. Because if everything is basically a transitional being, we're always moving, always changing. We're always being exposed to changes in the environment and genetics and that kind of thing. Yeah, I would say we probably still are. And we don't know into what, but one day we'll be able to look back at Homo sapiens as it exists now in 2018 and say, we were slightly different then.
Yeah, so let's have a look and see what the answer is.
Yeah. True, on the outside it may look like we haven't changed much, but humans are continuing to evolve, as are other animals, including the apes. We are still evolving new characteristics that help us survive in a changing world, from drinking milk to fending off diseases. Because we couldn't always digest milk till a couple of hundred years ago, talking about cow's milk. And then a couple of mutations which arose, I think, in Europe. And more and more people can digest cow's milk now. We're not talking about human mother's milk. We're talking about cow's milk. But you still get lactose intolerant people even today.
Yes, yeah, because it hasn't spread through the whole population yet. I get the reason this is an interesting question and important for people to know that we are still evolving today is because a lot of people have the opinion that we have reached the pinnacle of evolution. And
just because we're here.
The aim of evolution was to create us.
Yeah.
Whereas in reality, evolution is an ever ongoing thing, and every species is evolving at one speed or another. It could be a shark or a crocodile that is evolving so slowly it hasn't changed in millions and millions and millions of years. Or it could be humans that we only became in this current form about 200,000 years ago. Yeah,
it's not an absolute process which has an end goal in mind.
It absolutely doesn't have an end goal in mind. That's the thing people need to know.
Absolutely. So we go on to the second one. Evolution can only happen slowly over long periods of time. True or false?
Oh, this is an interesting one. I'm going to go false.
You are right, false. Almost everything changes a little over time as genes mutate. Evolution can happen over a time scale of thousands or millions of years, but that's not always the case. For instance, there's been a rapid rise in antibiotic resistance among bacteria. The first bacterium resistant to penicillin was found a few years after the drug started to be used on a large scale. So that's a great way to actually practically observe evolution happening is through these little animals like bacteria.
Yeah, and I didn't even think of antibiotics when I was thinking. I've read a study in my head about mosquitoes on London Underground during the Second World War. People were using the London Underground to avoid a bombing from the Germans.
Yeah.
Mosquitoes followed them down, and within a few generations of mosquitoes, those mosquitoes had evolved and can now no longer breed with the mosquitoes outside, and they've become their own species.
I'd forgotten about that.
Yeah,
that's an interesting one.
So yeah, it's not always something that happens over a large period of time. It can happen over a very long period of time.
It depends on the pressures that cause them to evolve.
Exactly.
If it's in a concentrated environment like the London Underground, then it will happen quicker.
Yeah,
and plus the reproductive rate is faster.
It is indeed. It is the pressure that is put on a population. There's examples where a small landmass, an island, has been cut off from a continent, and the animals, the pressure, less food, and that they've become very small very quickly. Within a few generations, they start to decrease in size because
island dwarfing, they call it.
Island dwarfing, and that's evolution in action.
And they think that's what happened to that species of early human, Homo floresiensis. They made their way somehow to the island of Flores. And when we found them, not that long ago actually, they found their skulls. They're really tiny.
Yeah, and they do think it was island.
And they're adults, you know, so they kind of shrunk.
Yeah, definitely. And they gave them the cute name of hobbits.
The Hobbit, yeah, they called them the hobbits. And maybe that's where that whole idea of little people came from, you know, in folklore. Who knows?
Yeah, definitely, because they would have interacted with other species at the time.
Yeah. Okay, next one. The giraffe's long neck is an excellent example of evolution. True or false? Oh yeah, that's very true. Charles Darwin argued long ago that the giraffe's long neck comes from natural selection. This is where individuals that have inherited characteristics which help them to survive and reproduce pass on the genes that make them successful. In the case of the world's tallest living land animals, the giraffes, those with long necks were more likely to survive hard times and pass on their genes to the next generation than their short-necked rivals, who weren't as good as reaching food from high branches. It's quite simple, isn't it, really?
When you look at it like that, the giraffe is a great example. But this is really interesting because this argument Charles Darwin come up with actually disproved a previous theory, or a previous hypothesis, that actually it was the stretching up that made the neck longer.
Yes, that's true.
I can't remember the name of the guy who came up with this idea, and that passed on to the next generation. Well, they have actually now proven that if you do something enough in your lifetime, it can turn on certain genes that can stay turned on in your children, and it maybe even the children's children, but it doesn't get passed on genetically, so it's not evolution at work. So it's an interesting one.
The body, whether it's a human body or a fish body or a single cell organism, is quite malleable anyway, and it can change, and there's such things as adaptations and modifications, which creationists will say that's all it is. But what are those things over a long period of time?
Yeah,
that's
once
evolution.
Exactly. Once you have an evolutionary pressure into that, and as you said, if the food source gets higher and higher, the giraffes with shorter necks and not as tall, they don't get to breed.
And a new species could possibly come out of that, like you have the chimps and you have the bonobos. They pretty much look the same, but chimpanzees tend to be a little bit more aggressive, and they will not mate together. They could, but they won't. So, where are we? Next one. Evolution can cause an individual to change during their lifetime. True or false? Well,
I've got to say this is false. I've never heard of anything.
No.
I've never heard of this happening.
Okay, let's have a look. Gives the answer here. False. Exactly. Evolutionary changes based on the changes in the genetic makeup of populations over time. Populations, not individual organisms, evolve. Gene changes are produced by random mutation, and over the course of many generations, natural selection may favor those that are advantageous, causing them to become more common in the population. Individuals retain the same genes throughout their lifetime. And I got to point out, although mutations can be random, natural selection itself is not random, which is it's another misconception.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting in the future, though, as we start to be able to manipulate genes ourselves. Because we will be changing the human genes. So that's gonna have a big impact on evolution going forwards.
Yeah, that is self-imposed evolution, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So, here's a good one. Humans are descended from monkeys. True or false? Well, that's I can understand, or can I, why some people think that they're almost right. If you go back far enough, I suppose there would be a common ancestor, which
you could call a monkey, but it was an ape of some sort.
It was an ape, yeah. It says, it's a common misconception that humans evolved from monkeys. In fact, we both evolved from a common ancestor which lived millions of years ago. Humans and chimps share more than 90% of the genetic sequence. Actually, I think it's about nearly 99%. Thus, they are our closest living relatives, but they are not our great-great-great ancestors. So we don't know what the common ancestor about 7 million years ago was like. It could have been chimp-like. It could have actually been more human-like. They're not sure.
Yeah, they misses out some important facts here, this one, though, because actually we had a common ancestor with chimps and bonobos. So actually chimps and bonobos have the same common ancestor as we do. But they are closer related because they split from a common ancestor after we split from a common ancestor.
That's right.
And we're closer related to them than we are to great apes.
Yeah,
because they split further down.
That's right. You have to look at it like a tree. Actually, it's more like a bush with things branching off in all sorts of directions, and twigs coming off twigs, and twigs coming off twigs, coming off twigs. And if you just look up phylogenetics, you'll be able to easily see a diagram that shows this bushiness that all creatures have, including human beings. There's about 20 different hominids now that we know of, and there might be more. So
I'd say from this one, the important phrase to remember is common ancestor.
Yeah.
When a creationist says, if we come from monkeys, why they're still monkeys, or if we come from chimps, why they're chimps. So I think the important thing to take from this question is the phrase common ancestor. Because at some stage, a creationist is going to tackle you on your Facebook or your timeline or something and say, if there are monkeys, how comes we came from monkeys? Why are there still monkeys? And the word is common ancestor. We had a common ancestor to chimpanzees.
It's not linear. That's what so many people think, because of that damned illustration which shows, the gibbon and the chimp, and then the hunched over ape-like man, and then the Neanderthal and the human. It's like we just slowly turned into something. Like it doesn't work that way.
The easiest way to explain this how it happened is actually using the chimps and the bonobos. They're completely separate species. At some stage, a river formed in Africa between one type of ape, chimp-like ape, and they didn't like going across the water, so therefore they never bred together anymore.
And they're still across, I forget which river that is, but they still, as chimps are on the eastern side, I think bonobos on the western side, even to today.
So for them being separate, that means they bred separately, and the pressures of their local environments enacted on their evolution, and that's why they are now different species. So it needs something to come and to separate species somehow, whether they move, whether something comes a barrier between them. A good example for how human evolution could divert in the future would be, say, we went up to Mars and we had a whole different population living on Mars that never travelled back to Earth, and we never travelled back to Mars. They would evolve completely separately from people on Earth, and at some stage we would become a completely different species of hominoid.
Yeah, absolutely, because obviously up on Mars the gravity is different, you'd be using artificial light, you might be eating different stuff,
and all the pressures are extremely different from what they are.
Your body just changes to keep up, basically. So, next one. Evolution results in progress. Organisms are always getting better through evolution. True or false? No. I wish it were true, but it is false. We tend to think of evolution as a process whereby species improve and become less primitive, but that's not always the case. Natural selection does produce improved abilities to survive and reproduce, but this does not always produce living things perfectly suited to their environment. Natural selection is limited by natural variation that appears by chance in a species, and once living things have gone down a certain evolutionary path, some improvements are impossible. For example, wouldn't it be great if we could get food from light, like plants? And for example, we became bipedal. Our ancestors, like I said, we think about 7 million years ago, probably actually stood upright in the trees first, is the thinking now. But the disadvantage which resulted is people have bad backs now. We've evolved an S-shaped spine, but it doesn't quite work for all of us, and we both know that, don't we?
Yes, we are both sufferers of evolution.
Yeah, and our brains got bigger, and unfortunately that made childbirth more painful, because in the case of the woman's pelvis, that hasn't yet evolved to allow the birth canal to be that little bit bigger to accommodate it.
Yeah.
So it's not perfect.
It's certainly, it's not got a goal, see, so that's obviously why it's not perfect, but we always see this thing as it's always progressing to something better, where all it is actually doing is progressing to be able to survive in the environment that it's in. So although we've got bigger brains and gained knowledge, there's been many times through history where things looked very very evolved for their environments, they don't exist anymore because of extinction.
Yeah.
So it doesn't need to be automatic progress. There is no goal. I think that's the one I concentrate on, telling people there is no goal, because if they get too much of a thought in their head that there is an aim of evolution, then they lose the focus of what evolution really is.
Absolutely. And we're on to the final one, which is question 7 of 7. Evolution and religion are not necessarily compatible. Ooh. True or false? Well,
this is an interesting one. This is the one the evangelicals sort of seem to have a problem with. And I think that's why they're so anti-evolution, anti-Darwin, and anti-science in some cases as well. So let's just read the question again. Evolution and religion are not necessarily incompatible. Now, I'd have to go for true on that one.
Let's have a look. True. Evolution is not about the origins of life, and this is a common mistake. It's not about how life began. We don't know that, and it's okay that we don't know that, but we're learning all the time. But it's about how animals and plants change over time. That's the important thing. Yeah. People of some but not all different faiths and levels of scientific training see no contradiction between science and religion.
Yeah, and I think they're stretching it by saying science and religion. I think they should. I think they should stick to the. There's no.
I'm just looking at that
contradiction between evolution and a belief in God or religion, because evolution, the fact of evolution, makes no statement whatsoever about how life started.
Yeah.
None whatsoever. It just tells the story that we know to be true. We know to be fact of what happened after life arrived on Earth. That's all it's telling, that story.
That's it. Yeah, it's how things change, how they evolve, whether it be slowly or more rapidly, and by what means, whether it be by the the environmental reason, whether you're cut off by a river or you end up at an island, or whether there's a mutation which happens to be beneficial, which does happen, folks. Another common misconception is that all mutations are bad, and you turn into a bug-eyed monster or nothing. But there are plenty of good mutations if you want to look that up. And
it doesn't say God does exist. It doesn't say God doesn't exist.
And there's plenty of people who subscribe to theistic evolution, which God created everything and put evolution in place and then set it off in motion.
And that's a hypothesis that we can debate. Until the end of time.
So we're not trying to take anyone's God away from them.
No.
But if you want to believe that there is a God, that's fine by us. But I think what really irks me, and I think you as well, Neil, is when the science has the explanations and it's got the predictive power that evolution has, and people go out of their way to say it's all false.
Yeah.
Or worse, it's all a lie.
Yeah. I mean, it's a scientific fact, and the sooner people get on board with that, I think the whole world becomes a better place.
Yeah. And
denying science is terrible in my point.
And on Talk Beliefs, I've done some evolution videos, and I get a lot of comments from creationists who, take it apart, everything that I've said, which is fine if they want to do that. But I'm always curious to know why it bothers them. Not just because it seems to contradict their beliefs, but a lot of it is because they hate the idea of being related in any way to an animal or have evolved from something lower.
This is a problem now, because if they're reading a book in a way that stops them accepting scientific facts, then that is a problem for society, as far as I'm aware. And the fact that these religious texts were written thousands of years ago by people who had no scientific knowledge, and they were giving their best ideas of the day of how things started, shouldn't affect your thinking today, whether you're religious or not.
And it could be one day, 100 years from now, who knows when, maybe tomorrow, someone will actually discover that, life changes for other reasons other than evolution. I don't think so.
It's almost impossible.
We have to be open to that.
You have to be open to testing it. But every time it gets tested,
but there's so much,
it actually gets better.
So much proof now. For 150 years, whether it be DNA, embryology, comparative anatomy, it just goes on and on and on. It just seemed crazy to think that there is some other theory, scientific theory, that will surpass this.
But the great thing about the scientific method is it will keep testing it. And looking at all the evidence up to now, I think it's just going to keep nailing it and getting better and better and explain
definitely
more
DNA.
And explain more.
I mean, there it is. It's like, you know, forensic science, you know, which is not far off the same thing. It's like, oh, right, there, oh, look, we all of us go back to Eastern Africa.
Yes.
Which is even what Darwin said, and he was just kind of like observing that the apes in Africa kind of looked like us, and it all started from there.
Yeah. So take the quiz, share the quiz with your friends.
Absolutely.
And see what they have to say.
And I think we'll just leave it there, Neil, and we're going to talk about some news about evolution and creation, which we've spotted. I think we'll have to leave that for next week. We're running a bit long, and that quiz was really entertaining, really enjoyed that, and hopefully some people got something out of it. And okay then, we will do that next week, and I will see you then.